Today we're going to be diving into one of the most controversial topics in all of Pokemon investing, vintage versus modern. If you're new to the channel, make sure you check out our other content around Pokemon investing. It's been a great series where we continue to build one on top of the next, starting with the foundations from base set all the way to the present of Scarlet and Violet, and then of course we look at the ROI of those sets over time. We ask the important questions about why. Why do those sets grow? And then we ask questions such as, which set do I buy now? Which set do I hold in my inventory so that it has the best growth potential? To top it all off, we give you free tools so you can track your investment journey with us here in Pokemon Wonder. Without further ado, let's dive into today's topic. Looking at the vintage versus modern has been something I've been struggling with. It's been quite difficult for me to try to wrap my head around how to really assess this and present it, just because there's multiple facets. There's of course changes in the market over time. What variables do you look at? What time frames do you look at? How do you assess which products to review? So all of those things really had my head spinning for quite some time, but I think I got a pretty good view on this now. Let's dive in and look at the numbers like we always do and take a look and see what we have to start with, and then we'll go from these concepts into something a bit more visual so that you can see not just the numbers and all the data that I have behind this in Excel, but also some of the websites that I use to actually get this data and how we look at both a booster box or sealed product perspective, as well as some of the individual cards or the chase cards from the sets. So to get us kicked off, one of the first things I wanted to look at is every set, and of course their respective release dates, their set value. So this would be the actual value if you owned every card in the set and had it in a binder, for example. We look at the trend for that data. We then look at the average card value per entire set. We then have a categorization of vintage versus modern, which I'll speak to that in just a minute. And then we look at the last booster box sold price, which takes us into some of our previous data where we looked at all the recent sellings, or at least the latest postings, depending on what was available to us. How many years from that's release date until the present date? So in this case, we were released on 1999 and it took us 24 years to reach 2023. And then we have year over year growth. This is simply a extrapolated average value from their original booster box price. And for this case, we're just talking about a flat, even $99 for every booster box. We know that some booster boxes, especially the older ones, sold a lot cheaper, but just to keep things simple, we keep it at $99 and of course look at the current value, and we look at year over year growth, and we just average that out to say what is that year over year average growth. Okay. Then we have years to maturity. To answer this question, you have to first answer what is maturity. In this case, we take maturity as the oldest set, and then of course it's years to present. So we take the maximum value, in this case it's going to be 24, and we then assume that if we fast forward every other modern set to the same 24-year time period, then what would its value be? That's why we talk about maturity, just in order for us to compare apples to apples, because obviously the older sets are going to be higher in value because they've been out longer. If you look at the newer sets, they've only been out for 1, maybe 2 years, maybe 3, and of course it's not an apples to apples comparison because you're not looking at them over the same time frame. And this is where the disclaimer comes into play. Of course, none of this is 100% accurate because none of it can be accurate. We're doing speculation, extrapolation, and many other concepts trying to guess what the future is going to be like. And nobody knows what the future is going to be like. But what we do have is we have facts about the past. We know how the present is currently behaving. And then from there, we can do our best to try to look forward and do our due diligence when it comes to making informed decisions and how we want to invest our money. So don't take just my word for it. Do your own research, look at other resources as well. And all we want to do is hopefully give you some free tools in your tool bag so that you can make informed decisions and make the best possible outcomes for your future. So that years to maturity, really then of course, if you look at this, because we're sorted by release date, and if you look at the years to maturity, you can assume that as we go down, we have of course more years to go to reach that 24 years, which is our current set date for maturity. And then last but not least, we extrapolate the growth over that year-over-year growth, and of course years to maturity, and then of course we try to estimate what would the value of that box be once it reaches the same amount of time that the current 24 year, which is the base set box, reaches. So we try to extrapolate that over with just year-over-year growth, assuming that everything's consistent. We continue to move forward. In looking at this, there's clearly lots of assumptions. Just a couple of those assumptions are that Pokemon stays a valuable product, people continue to desire it, right? The most basic things. Also, the growth of the product continues to go up year over year based on its current trajectories. To have year-over-year growth consistently is probably not realistic at all. But in order for us to look at this to some even playing field, we have to take some assumptions, and as long as we apply those assumptions somewhat evenly over all of the products and all of the sets, then it gives us a really level playing ground for us to try to assess the financials. Then as we look down, what we want to now clarify is what is vintage and what is modern. That categorization here for vintage and modern, you can see it breaks as we scroll down, and this is again in chronological order. We have a break right around black and white plasma freeze, and that's when we hit our first modern. And you can see on the years to present, we're reaching about 10 years. So anything above 9 years, in terms of 9 years old, we then assume that that is a vintage product. Anything 9 and below is going to be considered a modern product. Now that is a bit probably controversial to some of you because you can't buy a lot of these products easily and you have to pay a large price. Some may even consider that the Sword and Shield will be the only modern sets that we have, but that doesn't give a fair comparison. And given the time frame that we've spanned over these almost 30 years, we need to look at this a bit more subjectively and try to find a good playing ground. I've even heard a few others in the space talk about Pokemon Go and some of those other release dates being the key cutoff between vintage and modern. In this case, I think 10 years was quite enough. So with these understandings now in hand, the next thing that we want to look at is, well, what does that extrapolation of growth look like to maturity? Which sets between vintage and modern are at the top? And so if we take this column and we sort by that, we can see that we don't change too much. Vintage sits at the top, and these are all around the booster box price. I mean, obviously the set is talking about the entire set, and the trend speaks to the set itself, not to the booster box. And of course, average card value is quite explanatory itself. But everything else is around a booster box price. So everything from last sold, and of course, extrapolating the value, we're focused only on the booster box. And so when we look at this, we can clearly see that vintage sits at the top. And just take two examples. If we take the EX Deoxys box, which the last, I believe this was a listing, not an actual sold, because I couldn't find anything in the last 3 months. Because I try to look at something current and not something that's several years old, because it doesn't give a proper representation. But the listing prices for this one was around $78,000, and that gives us a year-over-year growth around $4,335. We have 6 more years to reach that 24-year mark. And if we extrapolate that into the next 6 years, then that gives us an ending value of $104,000. Again, this may not be true, but we have to treat all these things fairly, and we'll see how they play out throughout this analysis. The next one is around Skyridge. Skyridge, we look at that in the same way. We have a year-over-year growth of $3,554.87, and then you extrapolate that growth for another 5 years, and we reach $85,415.97. The first modern box we see, we gotta scroll down just a little bit, unfortunately, is around Team Up and Plasma Freeze and Flash Fire. Those are your first 3 modern boxes. And so from a Team Up perspective, I don't think anybody's surprised. It's one of the sets that have grown the most in the past year. And in this case, it is a year-over-year growth of $412.75. We have another 20 years to go to reach its maturity date, and that would give us about a $10,000 booster box price. Okay, and then the other one that we were focused on for today's analysis will be the flash fire. Flash fire was coming in at about a year-over-year growth of $313. And that gives us about 16 years to maturity, reaching a total of $7,302. Now, I know what you're thinking. You can't just take the booster box prices over the number of years and extrapolate growth and have that expected value to be there at the end. And you're 100% right. We don't think this is going to be the most accurate way to evaluate a booster box price. I would love to have the data for many sales over many years, but the reality is we don't have it. There's not massive amounts of data on EXD boxes because those boxes are not flying off the shelf. The same thing goes for Skyridge. It's not like 100 of those are being sold every month. So the best data we have is on modern, and I can't treat modern that way and then not have the same correlating data for vintage. So for us, we try to look as much at some of the other factors as we can. Again, the set price, average card value, last sold prices, and try to do our best to look at those data points we do have in order to make informed decisions. However, if you do have some data that you can share with us or point us in the right direction, please do let us know, and we'll be happy to redo this video and give it a more accurate representation. So now let's get back to the rest. There's lots of events that have occurred in the overall space of Pokemon that really questions, are we looking at this really fairly? Because we had Pokemon Go, we had the Logan Paul event. How do you take these into account? That's one of the things I really struggle with, because I wasn't sure, how could you just take out these events that occurred that potentially changed the price of these booster boxes and these cards forever? And then even if you didn't take it out, then how could you apply it to a new set and make sure that it was treated fairly in the same way? And so that was a very difficult thing to look at. But one of the things I noticed in my analysis was, if we think of this from the perspective of about November 2020, and then as we reach into 2021, that's where a lot of the boom occurs. And this is just one example. This is for the unbroken bonds using our camel. And from here, we can see that right around that November 2020, we start to have a steady uptick in this booster box price. I can't look at Amazon because they stopped selling it. It doesn't have a good representation of the price. But if we look at this from a third-party perspective, we can see that it continues to trickle up with some ups and downs. But for the most part, this just goes up and up and up, starting from the original around, looks like maybe $70, $80, and then jumping up to the $638 it's sitting at today. And when I looked at that, I wondered, well, first of all, where were these events occurring? The Pokemon Go, the Logan Paul events. And then, was it really just those events that changed the Pokemon space, or was there something else happening in the market? And so, in order for me to answer that question, I had to look at other spaces. I had to look at what happened in the stock market, what happened with metals, what happened with other goods and services in that time frame. And just taking a small subset of those, we can see here, for example, we look at the S&P 500 over the past 5 years. And we'll see quickly that here in the same time frame, as we jump from the 2020, end of 2020, and we start to move into 2021, we continue to have that same uptick trend that we saw within the Pokemon space. And this is just one example. Let's keep going. If we then also look at the NASDAQ, to keep it on the area of stocks for just a minute, we see again the same uptick. Now this was also around the time of the pandemic. This was around the time of stimulus checks that were coming out within the next year as well. So a lot of other factors were taking place, and it wasn't just these Logan Paul or Pokemon Go events that really spiked the Pokemon space, at least in my opinion. I think there's a lot of other factors at play here. We're not taking that into account sometimes when we talk about the price of Pokemon today, and we just kind of throw it over to Logan Paul and his events and anything big that happened in the Pokemon space, but in reality, it happened in most places. If we take another look, let's jump over to the Dow Jones, it did pretty much the same, not as aggressive, but here in 2020, and we start to uptick, and we keep on that trend for the most part all the way to the present. If we jump into commodities now and we ask the same question over the same time period, here we're using macro trends, we can see that we're running into something very similar. In the past 5 years, starting around 2020, we start to jump up and have the same trend here in copper. Okay, well, what about some other areas for commodities? Let's look at soybean prices. You might say, soybeans, what does that have to do with Pokemon? Well, look at the overall market. What's happening in the market, and is it isolated to what we're talking about today in Pokemon? And the answer, as you look at each one of these charts at the same time frame, is no. Every chart says the same thing. Right around 2020, at the end, middle to end of 2020, we start to see an uptick with some dips, but generally speaking, an uptick of large proportions in the same time frame across all areas. Let's take a look at a few more. Let's take a look at cotton prices. Same thing, cotton spikes up quite high all the way through the pandemic, and of course this one drops quite a lot here in 2022. Crude oil prices. Again, 2020 jumps up, continues to go up, and of course never reaches its previous low. It stays quite high even after it starts to dip a little bit. Every area that we're looking at here has a very similar story. Of course, some bigger drops, some bigger upticks, higher percentages, but the trend looks the same. And so it didn't really matter too much which area of the markets we look at. It follows the same trend as Pokemon. And as much as Logan Paul is a popular celebrity, he didn't impact all those markets. I actually then convinced myself that this wasn't a Logan Paul boom. This was an overall market boom. And because of that, I can't subtract anything from these. Everything at the current value represents its current market boom increase accordingly. Now, granted, some had a higher starting price. And so in order for us to really assess this apples to apples, we then need to focus on percentages of gains over a certain period of time and not necessarily the dollar value. If we focus on the gains over, let's say, a 2 or 3 year period, then that gives us a much better consideration for all things in the market trend, but not necessarily focused on the actual value at the moment, but more about what did it increase, how much did it increase, and over what period. And so if we look at it that way, we still see that in the booster box realm, the year-over-year growth is going to be quite high. In the last few years, unfortunately, don't have massive sales for booster boxes. I have had a very difficult time, and I can't find it on most of my resources, whether it's pokedata.io, Camel, eBay, TCG Player. If you're going back to these boxes that are vintage at the top, you can't find recent sales. And so for that reason, unfortunately, I cannot give a 3-year growth pattern for these booster boxes in vintage to say, well, how much did they sell year over year? Because you might have only had one sell, and in some cases you had 0. There's just not that many of these around anymore. Those who do have them are selling them at very high prices or holding. So in the cases of booster box prices, I just can't grab the data needed to build that picture. So for that reason, I jumped then over instead into the space of cards. So if we take then 2 sets from vintage and 2 sets from modern, and we compare some of the chase cards from those sets, that's going to give us a much better understanding how that data looks respectively to those sets and start to assess some of the overall value on each area. So the 2 that we selected from vintage is going to be EX Deoxys and Skyridge. The next 2 that I picked from modern is going to be Team Up and Flashfire. Both sets in each era respectively had great chase cards. Those are cards that have high value, very much sought after, and of course they have a lot of gradings in PSA. And so those are great sets for us to focus on and then switch over to the view of cards. So if we take EX Deoxys first, one of the top cards is the Rayquaza EX. This Rayquaza EX sold right around $300 as a PSA 10 in February of 2020. And so our time frame for this part of the analysis will start at February 2020 and end somewhere, if we can, around February 2023. So we have a 3-year span, or whatever the last sold price is. For example, here, the last sold price was in August of 2022, but most of the rest of those do have selling all the way through until the present. So here we have a big jump from the $300 mark in February 2020 all the way up to a $3,000 sold price in August of 2022. So a big jump, overall huge card. It's one of those cards that we all look at and wish that we had in our inventory if we don't already. And if we already have some, perhaps we want a few more. Looking at the other side of this from Charizard, now on Skyridge, the Charizard itself, again in February of 2020, it was selling for around, looks like about $2,700. And then as we move up and down through the years, we see that it's ending somewhere around the $11,000 mark here in the end of January 2023. So again, huge gains, big jumps in percentages. And of course, I'm not going to get into the details of the market cap and some of the rarities and how difficult it is and the quantities in PSA, but more about how did the value grow over 3 years. All things considered, all events considered, all the quantities and the PSAs and the popularity and the market caps, all those things considered, just tell me the growth. How much did it grow? And we compare that against the modern, and let's see what it looks like. Now, for the modern set, team up, I think we all know what that's going to be. That's going to be our Latios and Latias, and that one did extremely well also. So in February of 2020, we were looking somewhere around $50. So it started off extremely low, and we can see that's really skyrocketed with the same value that the booster box has. We ended somewhere around this $1,500 mark here in February 2023 with some massive gains. And again, a beautiful card, beautiful artwork. It's been very much sought after. And then we end this modern perspective on the Mega Charizard EX. This one also had a bunch of ups and downs. February kicking us off somewhere around $550, and then we end closer to the, looks like we didn't have too many sales between December and March, so March roughly is at $1,525. And so if you look at those cards from each of the respective sets based on how we look at the extrapolated set value over the next years to maturity, then this gives us a pretty good idea. So now we're looking at both booster box and individual chase cards. So now let's look at that same information, but in a nice summary format. Here, what we have is the prices from February 2020, and again, all the way to February 2023, or as close as we can get to that based on the data. And then that gives us an overall growth. So for the Rayquaza EX, we had a growth of 900%. 900% over 3 years. Amazing growth. And if we look at that from the perspective of Skyridge and Charizard, 311%. Now, not nearly as big as the Rayquaza, but nevertheless, massive growth. Then we look at the Latios and Latias full art. That grew 2,900% in the same time period. And then last but not least, the Mega Charizard is 177%. And so for us to look at those two combined and then look at the sets, or more importantly, the vintage versus modern argument we're trying to make here, we can see the combined growth, just adding our two percentages together, is 1,211, while our combined growth on the modern is 3,077. We're more than double on the perspective of the single cards. Now, if you look at the booster box prices, again, it looks a lot better on the side of vintage. When we're looking at the individual cards, it looks really good on the side of modern. So it just depends on what you're looking at and what information you're assessing, but trying our best to assess these as fairly as we can. We can see that there's quite a big difference when it comes to modern and vintage. So that's a lot of data and a lot of information, all to say what? What's the point? The point here is that it is going to be quite a challenge to assess fairly vintage versus modern. Where do you draw the line? What's vintage? What's modern? How do you get the data to assess them fairly? How do you take into account or remove market events? Do you look at the sealed or do you look at the cards themselves? Here, trying to be as well-rounded as we can, I think the summary is overall between booster box combined with cards, it's going to be quite close. However, we haven't seen what's going to happen for modern cards over the next 20 years. We have that history with the vintage. We know what happened. We know where we sit. Now, granted, we also don't know what's going to happen with vintage over the next 20 years. How is it going to continue to grow? Who's going to win in the end? It just depends on when the end comes and what the prices are at that very moment in time. For me, I think that vintage has a clear place and it's a clear winner in so many aspects. It's proven in the market to do well over time, and people are still nostalgic and love those older sets. Modern is carving a new path. It's creating something that we've never seen before. It has new arts, different types of cards, new game mechanics, so many things that we've never had in the Pokemon space. I don't know that we can really estimate what's going to happen over the future of modern. I think it might surprise us. Now, obviously, what Pokemon does next and how they continue to release sets has a huge impact. In the meantime, vintage is a place to stay. It's going to be consistent over time, and it's going to give you consistent value, and it's much more stable. Modern is going to have lots of ups and downs, lots of fluctuation, but it's going to hold its own over time, and it's also going to give potentially some growth we've never seen before as these cards become more and more scarce. Now, with all this in mind, you might be wondering, well, yeah, but I would like to understand, what does this data look like over all the sets? What should I be buying today? How can I take my next investment decision? So make sure you check out these videos here where we go through all the depths and the details, and we try to help you make informed decisions. We look forward to seeing you on the next one.